You hesitate before raising your hand. Not because the question is offensive, not because you want to argue, but because something inside you whispers that asking it might change more than the conversation. You have sat through countless sermons, lectures, conversations, and quiet moments of prayer, hearing people speak with remarkable confidence about ultimate truth. Yet one thought keeps returning whenever the room becomes silent. How do any of us know where conviction ends and certainty begins? The moment that question enters your mind, something uncomfortable happens. You are no longer simply listening. You are observing yourself listening. You begin noticing how easily the human mind reaches for explanations that provide stability, how naturally uncertainty creates anxiety, and how deeply every person longs for a story that makes suffering, love, injustice, and death feel connected instead of random. That realization is unsettling because it does not point at one religion or one worldview. It points at something profoundly human. We all want solid ground beneath our feet. We all want to believe that our deepest commitments rest on something stronger than hope alone. But what if one of the hardest questions is not whether God exists or whether any particular tradition is true? What if the harder question is whether we can honestly recognize the difference between what we know, what we infer, and what we desperately need to be true? Think about a moment when you asked a difficult question in a room full of people who already seemed certain of the answer. Maybe it happened in a place of worship. Maybe it happened in a classroom. Maybe it happened around a family dinner table. You probably felt something that had little to do with logic. Your heartbeat changed. Your mouth became dry. You started wondering how people would see you if you continued speaking. That reaction reveals something fascinating about human psychology. Questions are rarely frightening because they are complicated. They are frightening because they can reshape identity. If this thought has ever crossed your mind, leave your perspective below. Not because there is a single correct answer waiting to be discovered, but because different experiences often illuminate different parts of the same mystery. The more carefully you observe people, including yourself, the more you notice that certainty can become part of who we believe we are. When that happens, questioning an idea feels strangely similar to questioning ourselves. It is not simply an intellectual exercise anymore. It becomes emotional, personal, existential. That is why conversations about faith, meaning, purpose, and morality often become so intense, even when everyone involved sincerely wants to understand one another. Behind every argument, there is usually a deeper fear that if one important belief changes, countless other pieces of life might begin to move as well. Friendships, traditions, family expectations, cherished memories, and personal identity can all feel connected to those beliefs. Suddenly, a simple question carries enormous emotional weight. Perhaps the most surprising discovery is that this pattern appears across many different worldviews. Religious believers experience it, skeptics experience it, philosophers experience it, scientists experience it, political movements experience it. Human beings naturally build identities around stories that help organize reality. The difficult part is learning how to examine those stories without assuming that questioning them automatically destroys them. Sometimes sincere questions strengthen convictions. Sometimes they refine them. Sometimes they reveal uncertainty that was already there. And sometimes they simply remind us that the biggest questions in life may never fit neatly into the categories we prefer. That possibility can feel deeply uncomfortable, yet it can also become the beginning of genuine intellectual humility, where curiosity becomes more valuable than pretending to possess every answer, and where the courage to keep asking may matter just as much as the answers we eventually embrace. The longer you live, the more you discover that the greatest struggles rarely happen between certainty and uncertainty. They happen between two different kinds of certainty that both seem convincing depending on where you are standing. Imagine someone who has devoted decades to a particular understanding of reality. That understanding has comforted them through grief, guided difficult decisions, inspired acts of generosity, and given meaning to suffering that otherwise felt unbearable. Now imagine another person who spent years believing the same thing before gradually arriving somewhere entirely different after encountering experiences they could no longer ignore. Both people are sincere. Both believe they are following evidence as honestly as they know how. Both can point to moments that transformed their lives. If you only looked at their confidence, you might assume one of them must be pretending. But confidence alone tells us surprisingly little about whether an idea is ultimately correct. It often tells us far more about how deeply that idea has become connected to identity, memory, and hope. This realization creates an uncomfortable tension because it forces us to ask whether human conviction is always as objective as we would like to believe. Think back to childhood. Before you were capable of evaluating complex philosophical arguments, you learned countless things simply because trusted adults taught them to you. Language, manners, history, morality, customs, celebrations, fears, expectations, and beliefs all entered your mind long before you had the tools to examine them critically. That is not a flaw. It is how every human being begins life. None of us starts with complete independence of thought. We inherit stories before we analyze stories. We inherit assumptions before we recognize that they are assumptions. Eventually, however, a moment arrives when inherited beliefs encounter lived experience. Sometimes they fit together beautifully. Sometimes they clash. Sometimes the clash lasts for years. You may have experienced this yourself. Perhaps you prayed during a painful season and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Or perhaps you prayed just as sincerely and felt only silence. Perhaps a tragedy challenged your understanding of justice. Perhaps an unexpected act of compassion strengthened it. Human experience refuses to move in neat lines, which is one reason conversations about ultimate questions remain endlessly fascinating. Every person carries a different collection of memories that shape how they interpret the same events. Two people can witness the same situation and come away convinced of entirely different lessons because each is filtering reality through a lifetime of emotional experiences. This is where humility becomes far more demanding than confidence. It is relatively easy to defend a position when surrounded by people who already agree with it. It is much harder to sit across from someone equally thoughtful, equally compassionate, equally intelligent, who reaches a different conclusion, and genuinely ask yourself whether there is something you have not considered. That question is unsettling because it requires separating personal worth from intellectual certainty. If your entire identity depends on never reconsidering anything, every conversation becomes a battle to protect yourself rather than an opportunity to understand. But if your identity rests on a willingness to pursue truth wherever it leads, then difficult conversations become invitations rather than threats. That does not mean abandoning deeply held beliefs whenever someone disagrees. It means recognizing that confidence and curiosity do not have to be enemies. They can exist together. In fact, history suggests that many of humanity's greatest discoveries emerged not because someone already possessed all the answers, but because they refused to stop asking thoughtful questions. If you have ever wrestled with this tension between conviction and curiosity, share your experience below. Some people found that questioning strengthened what they believed. Others found that it transformed their perspective entirely. Neither story should be dismissed simply because it is different. The more we listen to one another honestly, the more we realize that the search itself reveals something profound about the human condition. We are creatures who crave meaning. We long for coherence. We seek patterns that make existence feel less chaotic. That longing is neither weakness nor proof of anything by itself. It is simply part of being human. Now the challenge is learning how to hold that longing with enough honesty that we do not mistake our desire for certainty as certainty itself. Perhaps the deepest question is not whether doubt is the opposite of faith, confidence, or conviction. Perhaps doubt can sometimes become the force that prevents our beliefs from becoming stagnant, forcing us to examine not only what we believe, but why we believe it in the first place. That possibility is uncomfortable because it offers no easy conclusion. Instead, it leaves us standing in a place where intellectual honesty, emotional vulnerability, and the search for meaning intersect. And it is precisely in that intersection that the next realization becomes even more difficult to ignore, because it shifts the focus away from institutions, traditions, and arguments, and places it directly on the person staring back at you in the mirror. Eventually, the hardest question stops pointing outward and begins pointing inward. It is no longer about whether a particular tradition, philosophy, or worldview has answered every mystery. It becomes a question about the kind of person you become while searching. Imagine reaching the end of your life and discovering that some of your conclusions were mistaken. That possibility exists for every human being, regardless of what they believe. None of us possesses perfect knowledge. None of us sees reality from every possible angle. The uncomfortable realization is that being wrong is part of the human condition. The more difficult question is whether we have lived with enough honesty, humility, compassion, and courage that even our mistakes became opportunities for growth rather than excuses for arrogance. There is something profoundly revealing about the way people react when their deepest assumptions are challenged. Some immediately become defensive, others become dismissive. Some retreat into silence, others become curious. Those reactions often reveal more about our relationship with uncertainty than about the ideas themselves. If every challenge feels like a personal attack, then perhaps our identity has become inseparable from our conclusions. But if we can remain thoughtful, even while confronting unsettling questions, we create space for genuine understanding instead of endless conflict. This does not guarantee that we will arrive at identical answers. In fact, honest people may continue to disagree about life's greatest mysteries. Yet there is a meaningful difference between disagreement rooted in humility and disagreement fueled by fear. The first leaves room for learning. The second closes every door before the conversation has even begun. Think about how often people assume that certainty automatically equals strength. In reality, some of the strongest individuals are those willing to admit the limits of their knowledge. They understand that confidence without self-examination can slowly become complacency, while endless skepticism without direction can become paralysis. Wisdom may lie somewhere between those extremes, where conviction remains open to reflection and curiosity remains anchored by integrity. That balance is difficult because it demands continual self-awareness. It asks us to notice when we are defending an idea, because evidence supports it, and when we are defending it because losing it would feel like losing ourselves. Those are not always the same thing. Human beings are remarkable storytellers. We tell stories about our families, our nations, our relationships, our successes, our failures, and our purpose. Those stories shape the decisions we make every day. They influence who we trust, what we fear, what we sacrifice, and what we hope for. The danger is not that we have stories. The danger is believing our own perspective is so complete that no further reflection is necessary. History repeatedly reminds us that certainty has sometimes inspired extraordinary acts of compassion and courage, but it has also justified tremendous mistakes when people stopped questioning themselves. That lesson extends far beyond religion. It applies to politics, science, culture, philosophy, and every area where human beings search for truth. The challenge then is not to eliminate conviction, but to cultivate the humility that keeps conviction from becoming closed-mindedness. Perhaps that is why the most enduring questions never seem to disappear. They continue returning generation after generation because each person must wrestle with them personally. No one else can complete that journey for you. Others can offer wisdom, evidence, experience, tradition, and arguments, but eventually you must decide how you will live in the presence of uncertainty. Will you avoid difficult questions because they are uncomfortable, or will you allow them to deepen your understanding of yourself and others? Will you treat people who disagree with you as enemies, or as fellow travelers attempting to navigate mysteries that exceed every human mind? If this reflection challenged you, whether you agreed with it completely, rejected parts of it, or found yourself somewhere in between, share your perspective below. The most valuable conversations are often the ones where thoughtful people explain not only what they believe, but how they arrived there. Those stories reveal that behind every conviction is a human life shaped by hope, disappointment, joy, loss, relationships, questions, and experiences that no simple argument can fully capture. Perhaps the question that seemed so frightening at the beginning was never dangerous because it threatened belief itself. Perhaps it was powerful because it threatened the illusion that any of us has finished learning. There is a profound difference between abandoning certainty and abandoning the pursuit of truth. The first may leave us lost, the second leaves us stagnant. But continuing to seek with intellectual honesty, emotional humility, and genuine compassion allows us to remain open to growth without surrendering our integrity. In the end, the question that matters most may not be whether you manage to eliminate every doubt or defend every conclusion. It may be whether your search for meaning made you more honest, more compassionate, more courageous, and more willing to recognize the humanity of those who reach different answers. If it did, then regardless of where your journey ultimately leads, the search itself has already changed you in one of the most important ways possible.